During the Third Reich's heyday, while Europe was being divided by blood and fire, another war was silently waged from castles, hidden farms, and state-funded expeditions. It didn't target peoples or ethnicities, but rather animal species that had to conform to the mold set by the hierarchy. While the front advanced, selective breeding programs were activated to modify the body and behavior of certain specimens, transforming them into biological extensions of the official doctrine. From 1933 until the final years of the conflict, a plan was executed to fill the East with creatures adjusted to strict physical criteria, not as wild fauna, but as living symbols of a new natural order. What was presented as applied science was, in reality, a systematic offensive to redraw the balance of the animal world. How many beasts were manipulated, bred, or designed to serve an ideology that sought to change the very root of life? Hitler's Zoo, the Nazi experiment to bring back extinct beasts. During the 1930s, two German brothers dedicated their days to a fixed idea that had little to do with nature as it was known. Their goal was not to study animals in their current state or to protect endangered species, but rather to use zoos as spaces for controlled reproduction where certain selected specimens would serve as the basis for recreating creatures extinct for centuries. These two men, Lutz and Heinz Heck, directed some of the country's most important zoos and had enough support to carry out experiments that, under other circumstances, would have been dismissed as impossible fantasies. One of them was in charge of the Berlin Zoological Garden, while the other managed the one in Munich, and between the two of them, they developed an idea that combined criteria of forced selection with the will to mold natural history according to the racial values being imposed at the time. The center of the experiment was the figure of the aurochs, a species of large bovine that had inhabited Europe for thousands of years before disappearing completely. This animal, represented in cave paintings and considered the ancestor of many modern cattle breeds, was seen by the Hecks as a symbol of strength, purity, and indigenous origin. The disappearance of the aurochs was not the product of a natural accident, but a direct consequence of human action, as its meat, hide and size made it a constant target for hunting. The last confirmed specimen died in the forests of Poland during the 17th century, and since then only fossil records and historical descriptions remained. However, for the Hecks, that extinction did not represent a definitive end, as they believed it was possible to recreate something very similar by starting with current bovine breeds. The method they devised was not based on recovering DNA or modern laboratory techniques, but on selecting animals with characteristics similar to those which, according to them, had defined the aurochs. Through multiple generations of crosses between specific breeds of bulls and cows, they hoped to concentrate the desired traits until they obtained specimens that, at least in appearance, resembled the extinct animal. The basis of this work included species such as Camargue cattle, the fighting bull, the Hungarian grey, and some primitive varieties from Eastern Europe. The resulting animals were selected for their colour, size, the shape of their horns, and their behaviour. If one did not show the adequate conditions, it was eliminated from the process, and if another met the criteria, it was reproduced to fix the trait. This form of work, known as backbreeding, sought to reconstruct not only the image of the past, but also its symbolic force, adapting biology to the political discourse of the era. The other great objective of the Hecks was the tarpan, a type of wild horse that had also disappeared from the continent. Considered by some scholars as the true European horse predating domestication, the tarpan was smaller than modern horses, with dark manes and strong legs. The brothers believed that if they managed to reconstruct it, they would obtain not only a valuable specimen from a zoological point of view, but also a symbol of natural resistance that could be inserted into the regime's educational and cultural programs. For this purpose, they used breeds such as the Przewalski's horse, the Polish konik, and other rustic varieties that still retained certain traits of the past. Unlike the aurochs, the tarpan had survived in some areas until the 19th century, so there were slightly more precise references regarding its shape and behavior. The animals resulting from these experiments were exhibited in special enclosures within the zoos they directed, where they were presented as restored versions of extinct species. These spaces not only served as showcases to display the achievements made, but also as pedagogical tools where ideas about the past, the land, and the supposed ancestral connection of the German people with their natural environment were reinforced. School visits, explanatory pamphlets, and public activities surrounding these new specimens emphasized their authenticity, even though they were actually modern constructions created from a combination of forced selection and ideology. The Hecks did not hide their intentions, but spoke openly of their desire to return to the country the species that, in their view, had been native to the territory before the influence of foreign cultures. The reconstruction of the aurochs and the tarpan was not presented as an experiment open to scientific discussion, but as a direct action with cultural aims. In this sense, selective breeding did not have as its final objective the expansion of knowledge about extinct species, but the reaffirmation of a narrative that sought to legitimize certain values considered essential. The use of visual criteria, such as the shape of the horns or the color of the coat, responded more to an idealized image than to detailed research. Instead of verifying whether the obtained results were biologically comparable to the original animals, the general appearance, the symbolic impact, and their utility within the national discourse were prioritized. The priority was not to scientifically reconstruct the specimen, but to mold functional figures for the cultural staging promoted by the regime. In parallel with the work on living specimens, the brothers also promoted reforestation campaigns and habitat adaptation within certain natural spaces where these animals could be reintroduced. The plan was to release restored aurochs and reconstructed tarpans into controlled areas where they could survive without constant intervention, as part of a regulated nature that responded to the ideals established by the powers that be. In some cases, the possibility of crossing these new animals with specimens that still retained wild traits was even explored, with the intention of cementing certain behaviors considered authentic. The goal was to create a complete landscape that, instead of representing actual biodiversity, projected a selective vision of the natural past, adjusted to the ideological parameters of the time. The Heck brothers did not develop their work in a closed environment or one limited to the zoological sphere. They collaborated with institutions that offered resources, logistical support, and political backing, which allowed them to advance quickly in their experiments. Their access to nature reserves, state hatcheries, and genetic archives was facilitated by the regime's interest in showing visible results. The conditions favored them to carry out tests with animals that, in other contexts, would have been seen as risky or unacceptable. Each specimen obtained was displayed as a collective achievement, supported by a network of laboratories, zoos, and officials operating under common directives. The creation of these animals was not just a personal initiative, but part of a broader structure that prioritized the exhibition of technical power and biological control at every possible level. Visitors to the zoos, upon observing these animals, were not invited to learn about the past from a scientific perspective, but to identify with a history reconstructed according to the needs of the present. The revived aurochs did not serve to study the evolution of cattle, but to reinforce the idea of a direct line between the land, the people, and primitive strength. The recovered tarpan was not an object of zoological curiosity, but a symbol of resistance, independence, and ancestral connection. The display cases, the signs, the guided tours, and the public speeches that accompanied these exhibitions were designed to generate a specific emotion, a feeling of pride linked to the restoration of a supposed natural balance that had been altered by external influences. Everything was part of a narrative strategy that replaced knowledge with the construction of a convenient story. The Aryan wolf, breeding, protection, and propaganda of the perfect predator. At a time when every gesture had to reflect the ideals of the new state, the figure of the wolf began to acquire a value that went beyond the biological. It was a creature that not only lived in the forests of the north and east of the country, but also embodied, in their view, traits such as strength, resilience, fidelity to the group, and defensive aggression against external threats. These traits, presented as parallels to those of the ideal citizen, made the wolf a useful figure for reinforcing discourses of cohesion, identity, and vigilance. In that environment, the officials in charge of preserving nature began to receive very specific instructions. It was not simply about preventing hunting or protecting endangered species. The goal was to ensure that the wolf could maintain itself in its natural habitat, develop freely, and be visible to the population as a permanent reminder of what the new order sought to preserve. Reports coming out of some forestry offices spoke of constant surveillance in key areas where isolated packs were known to remain. Barriers were put in place to prevent hunters from passing, and local patrols were organized that acted with unprecedented firmness, since any harm caused to these animals was interpreted as an indirect aggression against the country's values. In parallel with this strict protection, a sustained dissemination campaign began that included illustrated books, exhibitions, and educational material that showed the wolf not as a danger, as it had been represented for generations, but as a noble being who should be observed with respect. This transformation in popular perception was meticulously organized, and the selected images always showed specimens in a firm, serene posture, integrated into the natural landscape, far from any sign of threat. In schools, modules were incorporated where students learned about the wolf's behavior, its internal social structure, and its capacity to survive in adverse conditions. All of this was presented as an example of the type of society they sought to build. The oldest natural parks in the country were also adapted. In some cases, routes were redesigned to facilitate the sighting of wolves without altering their routine, and informative panels were installed that highlighted their historical presence in those lands. The visitor, walking through these spaces, received a clear message. The wolf was part of the soul of the territory, and its permanence represented a victory against the decadence of the past. In areas like the Harz or Lower Silesia, where the presence of wolves had been documented for centuries, guided tours were organized where forest rangers explained, with the support of maps and records, how these animals had resisted the transformations imposed by industrialization or wars, always maintaining their behavior pattern. Beyond what was visible, detailed studies on the wolves' breeding areas, seasonal displacements and feeding were also promoted. This information, collected in specialized archives, served both to reinforce control and to demonstrate that actions were being taken on a scientific basis. The technicians involved in these tasks belonged to specific departments that depended directly on figures close to the political leadership of the country, confirming that this was not a marginal initiative. Furthermore, certain internal documents showed that the protection of the wolf was not just a naturalist matter, but a way to reaffirm the connection between people, land, and the wild animal, without the need to express it in allegorical terms. In some local celebrations, especially in eastern regions, references to the wolf were incorporated into posters, songs, and civic rituals. The images were sober, without extravagance, but always reinforced the presence of this animal as a silent figure watching from the forest. Even some uniforms of youth organizations included discreet embroideries or insignias that evoked the figure of the wolf, not as a central symbol, but as a detail that recognized its value. These elements often went unnoticed by the visitor, but were easily recognizable by those immersed in that daily narrative. In the following years, conservation orders were extended to more distant regions, where evidence of isolated groups of wolves still existed. Restricted access areas were created, sometimes protected with the help of paramilitary units or rural surveillance groups that reported suspicious movements. The priority was not only to prevent direct hunting, but also to prevent alterations to the ecosystem that could affect the packs. This included limiting the expansion of certain crops, regulating the installation of new infrastructure, and controlling the access of outsiders without justification. All of this was part of a silent plan that sought to guarantee the survival of the animal under conditions that would keep it strong, free, and adapted to the landscape where it was born. In several archival documents, the efforts to prevent the hybridization of wolves with other similar species that could alter their behavior are also detailed. The authorities in charge of these controls acted quickly when signs of crossbreeding were detected, and in some cases, direct actions were authorized to prevent the reproduction of specimens considered unsuitable. This genetic surveillance, although not publicly promoted, was a logical extension of the thinking surrounding the animal and its function within the country's imagination. Filmmakers of the time were also summoned to produce controlled images of the wolf in its environment. Some of these films were used in newsreels, while others were included in school outreach materials. In all cases, the editing avoided showing weakness, sickness, or decline. The shots were selected with extreme care, always seeking the image of the animal alert, attentive to its surroundings, with precise movements and a firm expression. The voices accompanying these scenes were neutral, without drama, but their grave and slow tone reinforced the idea that this was a being with its own dignity, whose existence deserved respect. This type of audio-visual representation consolidated the collective perception that the wolf was not just any animal, but a species worthy of special protection. In reports addressed to higher authorities, the educational impact of this communication strategy was frequently valued. The officials indicated that, compared to previous periods, most young people no longer saw the wolf as an enemy of the peasant or a threat to livestock, but as a legitimate part of the national landscape. Local anecdotes were also mentioned where children, upon finding tracks or hearing howls, did not react with fear but with curiosity, and sometimes even with pride for living in an area where these animals resided. These responses were interpreted as indicators of success in the transformation of collective consciousness. At the same time, plans were elaborated to extend this policy to neighboring countries where the wolf had been more severely persecuted. There was talk of sending experts, sharing experiences, and supporting reintroduction programs, always under a narrative that avoided explicit political references. These actions were presented as technical collaboration, although the documents clearly indicated that the goal was to promote a conservation model based on the country's own values, distinct from those prevailing in other parts of Europe. In this sense, the wolf also became a diplomatic tool, a symbol that helped to export a particular vision of the balance between human being and nature. Thus, what began as a specific protection measure turned into a structured project that combined vigilance, cultural dissemination, education, territorial control, and biological monitoring. The wolf, without changing its form or behavior, was discursively molded until it became a key figure within the country's ideological landscape. Dogs that thought like soldiers, the telepathic canines experiment. During the strangest years of the German war machine, not all secret orders focused on weapons, explosives, or conventional military strategies. In parallel with training on maneuver fields and projectile tests, a small group of officers worked in a direction that would seem absurd today, but which at the time received attention and resources, teaching certain domestic animals to execute complex tasks using methods that bordered on the fantastic. It wasn't about physical training, nor traditional use in missions. What was attempted was for some dogs to be able, with the help of mental stimuli, to interpret orders without the need for verbal contact or gestures. All of this occurred far from the known barracks, in isolated spaces where documents did not leave and visits were restricted. In those places, those in charge were not recognized scientists or specialists trained in prestigious centers, but rather individuals obsessed with the inexplicable, people who defended the possibility that animals could develop hidden abilities, even communicate without speaking. The idea had not come out of nowhere. In previous years, some publications had already reported news about dogs that seemed to respond to human thoughts, that guessed words, that understood symbols, and that reacted to non-visible stimuli. Although most considered that a hoax, there were those who took it as a sign of something possible, a tool to explore within the military context, especially in times where anything could be exploited. The program was developed in a rural environment, away from urban centers, where kennels, observation rooms, and isolation spaces were installed to avoid distractions. The selected animals were mostly of medium size, with stable temperament and easy to handle. The priority was that they have physical resistance, but above all that they showed a certain capacity to react to unusual stimuli. Some came from specific breeding centers, others were taken from occupied zones, and all went through a basic evaluation process before being integrated into the mental training sessions. The sessions began with simple exercises. Words were placed on boards, sounds were assigned to certain movements, and they were stimulated with treats, noises, lights, or combinations of tactile signals. The purpose was for the animal over time to be able to associate concepts with actions. If it managed to touch a board that said "eat" with its paw before food was offered, the result was noted. If it responded with a bark to a written question, the behavior was recorded. Over time, these small achievements began to generate enthusiasm among the project leaders, who believed they were witnessing an uncommon communicative evolution. Internal reports spoke of dogs that could spell their names with letters, that reacted to numbers, and that even identified images on paper. Most of this data was not verified by independent sources, and access to the facilities was so restricted that not even the closest superiors could confirm what was happening there. Even so, those responsible continued to send documents to their commanders, assuring them that the progress was real, that there was a way to use this connection with animals in surveillance missions, threat detection, or sending messages between lines without the need for radios or messengers. One of the most repeated exercises involved placing a dog in a closed room and its handler in a separate one, separated by several walls and without sound contact. The handler thought of an action, for example that the dog should sit, move toward a corner, or remain still, and observers recorded whether the animal did it. When this happened, it was noted as a success. If it did not react, it was tried again. Occasionally, false stimuli were introduced to check if the result was real or casual. According to the organizers, the success rates exceeded the percentage expected by chance, which reinforced the idea that the animal was, in some way, reading thoughts. Variants were tested. Sometimes the dogs were trained with different people to see if that connection could be transferred. In other cases, objects such as cards, photographs, or items of clothing were introduced for the animal to identify which corresponded to the handler's thought. Tests were conducted with numbers, locations, and movements. The possibility was even explored that they could receive instructions in the open field without direct contact, something that, in theory, would allow the animals to be used in sabotage tasks or locating people without the need to expose human soldiers. The individuals in charge of the project had no prior experience in animal studies. Their profile combined superstition, obedience, and a desire for results. What interested them most was not understanding how the process worked, but demonstrating that the reports were true and that these dogs could be useful in the future. Entire pages were written with descriptions of dogs that supposedly knew more than 50 words, that responded to complete sentences, that knew when the sun would rise, or that detected lies. All of this was written in a serious tone, as if they were real scientific advances, even though the methods followed no accepted standard, and the data was not reviewed by external experts. Propaganda also played an important role. Some local newspapers published reports about these animals, calling them the four-legged soldiers, claiming that they would soon be on the front using their special abilities. The images showed dogs in front of blackboards, handlers writing phrases, and animals with a fixed gaze, as if they understood what was happening. These photos served to reinforce the idea that the country was at the forefront, even in animal training, and that the mind could be used as a weapon. With the passage of time, the project began to lose support. As urgent needs increased on other fronts, the resources allocated to these types of experiments were reduced. There was no official closure or public statement. Talk of the subject simply ceased. The archives were stored, the kennels closed, and the rooms used for other purposes. Some of the individuals in charge disappeared from the military documentation without a trace. Others continued working in less visible areas of the state apparatus. The dogs, for their part, remained as a chapter that is rarely mentioned, an attempt to convert into a tool of war something that was never reliably proven. It is not known for sure how many animals passed through those facilities, nor how many actually executed the tasks mentioned in the reports. What was recorded, however, is the effort invested in an idea that mixed desire, superstition, and strategy, at a time when every possibility was pushed to the extreme, even if it lacked provable foundation. Elite horses, racial purity in the stables of the Third Reich. During the rise of the National Socialist regime, horse breeding acquired a strategic and symbolic importance that went far beyond military or agricultural utility. The regime promoted a deliberate policy of equine selection based on criteria of racial purity, body aesthetics, and obedience, which led to the strengthening of breeds considered noble, including the Trakehner, the Lipizzaner, and the Hanoverian. These horses were not only used in parades, ceremonies, or officer training, but also embodied an idealized vision of the perfect body, strong and disciplined, that was meant to project the new racial order. Instead of prioritizing animal functionality in the field or in war, the Reich administration invested resources and propaganda in highlighting the noble character of the horse, linked to the Prussian imperial legacy and the equestrian traditions that Hitler and his circle wished to recover as a symbol of historical continuity. The Trakehners, in particular, were bred in the regions of East Prussia under strict genetic improvement programs. Specimens with long limbs, an elevated posture, a firm gaze, and elegant movements were sought, capable of withstanding both high-level horsemanship and the harsh demands of the army. Official studs, such as the one in Trakehnen, became spaces controlled by technicians, veterinarians and officers who evaluated each specimen with criteria of purity similar to those used in the classification of people. The horse had to show physical balance, submission to the rider, contained energy, and the absence of degenerate traits. Every physical defect, every anomaly, every lack of proportion was eliminated from the lineage with the same logic that guided racial hygiene policies in humans. In addition to the Trakehner, the Lipizzana was adopted as an emblem of the equestrian refinement that Nazism wanted to exhibit to the world. Traditionally bred in Austria and associated with the Spanish riding school of Vienna, this white horse, with precise movements and classical dressage, was elevated to the rank of a national symbol. The preservation of this breed was considered a priority even in the final years of the conflict, to the point that military units received special orders to evacuate select specimens and move them to safe zones before they fell into enemy hands. The Lipizzana, with its light coat, arched neck and ceremonial gait, perfectly fitted the racial aesthetic the regime promoted: visible beauty, clear origin, and absolute obedience. To sustain these programs, the Reich established collaboration networks between veterinarians, SS officers, and party-affiliated breeders. State studs received direct financial support, fertile land, and military protection. In regions like Paritz, Neustadt Doss, and Moritzburg, large-scale equestrian facilities were installed, where selective criteria were applied for both reproduction and training. Feeding, environment, and treatment were optimized to obtain specimens that were docile, strong, and visually impactful. Foals were observed from the first months to detect aptitudes or defects, and only a minority were accepted into the advanced domestication and breeding programs. In many cases, the riders who trained these horses were also officers with ideological training, which reinforced the connection between animal purity and fidelity to the party. The connection between the horses and the regime's ideology was also evident in public spectacles. During the years of the Nazi power consolidation, party-organized parades included equestrian sections in which white horses, ridden by uniformed riders, paraded through streets decorated with flags and banners. These scenes were carefully planned to convey order, contained strength and harmony between man and animal. The regime's photographers captured images where the horse looked straight ahead, erect, as if it shared the same will as its rider. In propaganda films, shots of horses galloping in slow motion, crossing meadows, or executing complex maneuvers served as visual metaphors for the new order that Nazism intended to impose in Germany and Europe. One of the less visible objectives of these policies was to consolidate a model of controlled reproduction that was rigorously applied within the equestrian field. Decisions about each cross were made following criteria set by the regime's technicians and supervisors, who registered, evaluated and approved each line of descent with the purpose of maintaining a strict morphological standard. The entire process was documented, from feeding to the environment, and interventions were made at any phase that put the expected result at risk. The SS, in particular, played a key role in the appropriation of equestrian tradition. Himmler, a great horse enthusiast, promoted the creation of equestrian centers for the training of his officers, where they were taught not only to ride, but to embody the aesthetic of the 20th century cavalier. The horse was not just a means of transport or a show animal. It was an extension of the officer's body, an extension of his will. The photographs of Himmler next to his horses, or the images of high-ranking SS officers inspecting studs, were not casual. They reflected a vision in which racial superiority also had to be expressed in the way of breeding, riding, and dominating animals considered noble. Another of the prominent elements was the participation of German riders in international competitions, including the Olympic Games. The Reich's equestrian delegations were selected meticulously, not only for their sporting ability, but for their appearance, posture, and ideological loyalty. Winning a medal was not an end in itself, but a way to demonstrate that the National Socialist racial model produced superior bodies, both human and animal. Every victory was celebrated as proof of the effectiveness of the regime's policies. Award ceremonies, where the horses raised their heads as the anthem played, were portrayed as moments of shared glory between nation, rider, and beast. During the years of territorial expansion, the Nazis also expropriated stables and breeding lines in the occupied countries. Polish, Hungarian and Yugoslav horses were transported to Germany to be integrated into selective breeding programs. Some specimens were considered pure enough to improve the German lines, while others were eliminated or relegated to minor tasks. This zoological looting was part of a broader policy of resource appropriation that included works of art, cultural heritage, and also animals. Racial superiority was not limited to man. It also had to dominate the fauna, regulate it, hierarchize it, and exploit it. Towards the end of the conflict, when the regime's structures began to disintegrate, numerous specimens were left to their fate or ended up in the hands of the Allied forces. Some Trakenas and Lipizanas were ridden in the last defensive cavalry operations, while others were discreetly moved to isolated areas by the decision of the Nazi authorities themselves. Archives exist that mention caravans escorted by officers, tasked with moving select groups of animals toward rural zones out of immediate enemy reach. That mobilization, executed during a full retreat, illustrates the symbolic value that these horses maintained within the state apparatus. Forgotten experiments, small creatures with lethal purposes. While military divisions were reorganizing on the Eastern Front, in other corners of the Reich, wooden boxes were being opened that contained no rifles or tank plans, but rather jars with live insects, cages with trained rodents, and vials with substances that, when absorbed through skin or mucosa, could cause immediate effects. There, far from the trenches, other ways of attacking without bullets were discussed, where the most insignificant animals became part of a faceless war. It was not about legends or symbols, but about discrete plans where the enemy would not see the blow coming. One of the most silent projects consisted of using infected fleas to spread diseases. The model came from the observation of techniques already seen in Asia, but what was sought in Germany was to improve their propagation, adapt it to different environments, and make it undetectable. The fleas were bred in laboratories where they were injected with active cultures, and then they were stored in sealed ceramic capsules that could be released from the air. The idea was that, upon breaking when touching the ground, they would release thousands of specimens that would jump onto any nearby warm body. Not even an explosion was needed. At the same time, in other centers, studies were underway on how to modify the behavior of rats to carry out infiltration tasks. It was not an imaginative espionage plan, but a real training program based on electrical stimuli. Methods were tested to make a rodent cross a tunnel and activate a detonator upon reaching a point marked by olfactory signals. The tests were slow, and although the results were never standardized, there were documents indicating the intention to deploy packs of these animals in urban areas before bombardments. Not to kill, but to cause chaos, alarm, and unnecessary movements. In a more experimental area, reports appeared about the use of bees as natural sensors. Some scientific units of the Reich worked with the concept of training bees to detect the presence of enemy chemical substances, buried mines, or even hidden people. When exposed to certain compounds, the bees modified their flight paths and clustered in specific areas. They were not thought of as weapons, but as early warning mechanisms. Although this program was not approved for deployment, its existence is confirmed in research archives dated between 1942 and 1943. In parallel, some reports included tests with scorpions. These were enclosed in glass capsules hermetically sealed with neutral gas. Upon being dropped from a certain height, the impact released the arthropods into closed spaces like underground shelters or surveillance posts. The objective was to create confusion, force exits, cause unexpected injuries, or simple accidents that would demoralize. The choice of the scorpion was based on its resistance, its defensive instinct, and its ability to hide in crevices, where it could then attack anyone who felt safe behind armored doors. There were also attempts to apply these principles to the aquatic world. One of the most striking documents referred to a program that aimed to use fish as carriers of small explosive charges. The procedure consisted of adhering devices to the fish's body using tiny harnesses made of waterproof cork. The idea was to release them into rivers or canals near bridges, where they would instinctively seek out dark areas or submerged structures. Although precision was unlikely in controlled spaces, a detonation might be enough to break pipes or cause a local flood. Another lesser-known line of study explored the use of toads as toxin generators. Some species secreted dangerous substances through their skin, which could be carefully collected and mixed with other components to create irritating gels or pastes. These products were applied to objects that were then handled by the enemy. Although they did not kill, they caused burns, fever, and in some cases temporary blindness. They were not classic poisons, but rather irritating compounds developed from animal secretions. Their value lay in their ease of acquisition and their invisible nature. Even earthworms were considered in marginal proposals, not as a direct weapon, but as a test system for contaminated soils. Some units intended to evaluate the toxicity of certain terrains using the behavior of these invertebrates. If they moved away or died in minutes, the soil was considered unviable for installations. This is how routes, camping spots, and areas where vehicles should avoid stopping were defined. It was not a lethal program, but it was part of the framework where animal life was reduced to a measuring instrument. One of the most extreme ideas arose in laboratories near Berlin, where attempts were made to use snakes as a means of infiltration. They were stored in long tubes, kept lethargic by low temperature, and released into spaces where the enemy might take refuge. The plan foresaw that upon recovering their mobility, they would move toward warm areas such as blankets, bags, or shoes. Although the risk was low, a bite in the night could generate panic, delays, evacuations, or errors in judgment. There was never a confirmed successful operation, but the trials with real vipers are recorded in several field notes. Another line was even more risky: the use of birds to transport light loads. Some fast-flying species were trained to cover short distances with metal cylinders tied to their bodies. These contained flammable powder that, upon falling on certain surfaces, could be ignited with chemical delay mechanisms. The problem was that many did not reach their destination, or the weight affected their flight. Even so, there is evidence of several tests carried out in open fields with modified pigeons. The precision was low, but the concept was considered valid for attacking grain depots or warehouse roofs. In an even more experimental proposal, the use of bats as carriers of incendiary elements was investigated. Small tubes with a timed fuse were attached to them, and they were released in urban areas at dusk. When seeking refuge, they would enter attics, barns, or wooden roofs, where the device was expected to activate with enough delay not to alert the surroundings until it was already burning. Although this program is associated with other powers, notes appear in German archives indicating that its viability with local species was explored, without conclusive results. Even mollusks had their place. In a specialized unit, the placement of chemical sensors inside mussel shells was tested to detect spills or products dissolved in the water. The goal was not to attack, but to identify contaminated routes or enemy activities in river channels. These animals, by opening or closing their shells according to the purity of the environment, functioned as natural alarms. Although their use was discarded due to slowness and dependence on stable conditions, it demonstrated how every possible niche was explored, even in immobile creatures. Finally, the use of powdered insect eggs as a delayed weapon was proposed. They were distributed over seemingly harmless objects, and upon contact with moisture or adequate temperature, they hatched. The result was a sudden infestation in closed areas, from trenches to train cars. More than physically harming, they sought to cause revulsion, abandonment, irritation, inability to rest, and a sense of insecurity. It was an indirect way to fatigue the enemy without entering combat. The Dragon of the Reich, symbol, stone, and fire in the heart of Nazism. It was not necessary for it to breathe fire or emerge from a cave to become a central figure in the Nazi imaginary, because the dragon they represented, sculpted and repeated in their monuments, was not just any fantastic creature, but an emblem laden with political, ideological, and visual intention. It began to reappear in official symbols, building facades, reliefs, esoteric emblems, and private rituals as the regime consolidated its narrative of the past, doing so by drawing on elements taken from ancient Germanic tales, medieval codes, Romanesque sculptures, and reinterpretations that exaggerated the role of a creature that never existed, but which occupied a very real place in the mental architecture of Nazism. This creature, with an elongated body, serpentine head and sharp claws, was used in contexts where it was not necessary to speak of animals, but of power, purity, domination, or the symbolic extermination of an enemy. That is why it appeared as much on the entrances of reappropriated castles as in schools for ideological training, Nordic-inspired temples, or spaces where indoctrination had to appear part of an ancestral heritage. The dragon revived by the Third Reich's visual apparatus did not come from children's stories or modern illustrations, but from medieval representations that had been recovered during the 19th century, by nationalist currents that saw in these beasts a symbol of the heroic struggle of the Germanic peoples against what was foreign, dirty, or demonic. In that context, the dragon was transformed into a ductile figure, capable of representing both the chaos to be destroyed and the invincible power that seizes the territory. This double function granted it a unique value. It could appear as the enemy defeated by the racial hero, known or anonymous, or as a protective force, guardian of blood, land, and ancient secrets. This ambiguity was intentional, and it allowed the regime's leaders to use the dragon as part of a closed message for the initiates, where not everything was comprehensible at first glance, but where every figure, stone, or design spoke a hidden language that connected with lost rituals, distant times, and notions of purity. In Wuelsburg Castle, which Himmler transformed into a training center for his most ideologically committed officers, dragons appeared sculpted on columns, embedded in stained glass, engraved on door frames, and repeated in reliefs that did not follow a random architectural pattern, but an organized scheme according to a symbolic vision of space. Each room had its own arrangement of figures, and the winged beasts were reserved for certain corridors, staircases, or halls linked to ideas of initiation, control, or death. Unlike other places in the Reich, where the eagle or the swastika dominated the environment, there the dragons occupied a much older and more reserved role, and those who walked through those spaces did so knowing that they were not facing mere decorations, but fragments of a world visually reconstructed with a precise intention. Outside the walls of that castle, other institutional spaces of the regime also adopted the figure of the dragon in stone reliefs, ritual flags, and classrooms decorated for ideological purposes. In schools where a manipulated version of the past was taught, educational materials showed illustrations that pitted this creature against an idealized warrior, a carrier of the values of the new order. The scene, repeated in books and murals, was intended to consolidate a Manichaean vision where certain figures represented the corrupt and others the restorative. The mythical creature thus functioned as a figure of absolute contrast, integrated from an early age into a pedagogy that converted symbols into implicit instructions. The presence of the dragon was not limited to visual or architectural art. In several private ceremonies organized by party sectors more linked to occult currents, this creature was incorporated into rites, insignia, and study circles where elements taken from Germanic paganism, medieval alchemy, and the most extreme racial theories were combined. Some internal documents of these groups show emblems where the dragon surrounds a specific rune, as if its body functioned as a protective seal or as a serpent guarding a knowledge reserved for the chosen ones. These images were not part of the regime's public discourse, but they were part of its internal belief system, where the visual had the same weight as the ideological. In some temples built by organizations close to the party's esoteric circle, such as certain structures in Bavaria or Saxony, dragons were carved into the bases of columns or integrated into stone rosettes that represented cycles, mythical genealogies, or ritual maps. There they were not spoken of as literary figures, but as guardians of the sacred custodians of an ancient order that Nazism intended to reactivate under a new name. Some internal writings of these groups refer to dragons as guardians of the blood, protectors of the entrance, or those who do not sleep, phrases that accompanied drawings with calculated positions and shapes, not left to chance. This obsession with the symbolic structured part of the design of these places, which were used as centers for meditation, indoctrination, or planning. In addition to its function as a visual symbol, the dragon was also used as a narrative figure in internal discourses. In some texts reserved for intermediate leaders, adapted stories were used where a pure people had to cross a valley inhabited by dragons to reach their destiny. These texts, although disguised as parables or myths, were actually ideological structures that reinforced the logic of sacrifice, purifying violence, and the elimination of the different. The dragon was not, in that context, a fantastic creature without function, but a visual and narrative excuse to justify a worldview based on the constant confrontation between the pure and the impure. During the final phase of the regime, when chaos began to dominate both the front and the rear, some tried to recover the use of the dragon as a figure of resistance. In certain internal pamphlets and last-minute designs, the silhouette of this beast reappeared alongside messages that spoke of the guardians that still burn, or the flames that are not extinguished, phrases that appealed to the most fanatical core of the regime's followers, and that used this image not as an external threat, but as an internal force still alive. That last appearance of the dragon did not have a relevant impact, but it demonstrates how the regime used the same visual figures until the end to sustain a narrative of immortality and eternal duty. With the defeat of the Third Reich, many of the places where these figures were found were dismantled, destroyed, or transformed. However, some sculptures, reliefs, or emblems survived, and over time they became part of studies on the use of symbolism in modern dictatorships. In these analyses, the Nazi dragon does not appear as a creature taken from fairy tales, but as a product of an ideological machine that understood the power of the image, the myth, and the scenography to manipulate the perception of reality. The figure of the dragon, which in other contexts could be a symbol of wisdom or fantasy, was in this case a tool of symbolic domination, a deformed mirror where the regime projected its worldview. The visual legacy of the dragon within Nazism cannot be understood as a simple aesthetic whim, nor as a fantasy of collectors of ancient bestiaries. It was part of a complete narrative structure, where every figure had a function, every shape had a message, and every creature, real or imagined, had to serve an idea of absolute control. And although it did not fly or speak, the dragon of stone, iron, or paper fulfilled its mission, to be seen, to be remembered, and to speak without the need for words within a system that converted the symbolic into politics. Failed mutations, the aberrations the Reich never showed. In several rural research enclosures, especially in northeast Germany, some officials began to experiment with reptiles that did not respond as expected, crossing local varieties with species brought from colonized areas in Africa and Asia, where humidity and heat generated internal deformities that no one could explain. Right there, specimens emerged that lived for barely a few hours, with incomplete scales, fused jaws, or exposed spines, while those in charge insisted on forcing new generations to find a form that could better adapt to the European environment, even if the process involved eliminating hundreds of hatchlings in a matter of days. In another facility located in Silesia, tests were carried out on nocturnal birds that were subjected to continuous artificial lights, altering their natural cycles with the objective of reducing rest and extending periods of activity without interruption. This gave rise to species that lost orientation and began to hit the walls of the cages until they were completely disfigured. And although some observers noted that certain birds managed to keep their eyes open longer than normal, there was no useful result beyond the destruction of the specimens and the accumulation of waste on the enclosure roofs, where the animals usually crashed at dawn. In a forested area near Pomerania, a group specializing in amphibians attempted to mix lineages separated by thousands of kilometers, bringing frogs from tropical ponds to combine them with native varieties from German ponds. This generated a sequence of malformations, where some presented supernumerary legs, semi-transparent skin, or a total inability to jump, which caused them to remain immobile until they were devoured by their own sisters. Meanwhile, those responsible documented everything with black and white photographs that they later destroyed for fear that they would fall into external hands, although some copies remained stored in unlabeled envelopes. Further south, in Bavaria, small mobile laboratories were installed where live specimens of bats brought from areas of Eastern Europe were transported, subjected to artificial climates and forced feeding routines, with the purpose of generating mutations that would allow for an increase in wing size and a modification of echolocation patterns. However, the result were creatures that could not fly, with disproportionate skulls and broken ribs that protruded when they moved. And although some technicians claimed to have seen repetitive behaviors similar to programmed patterns, there was no way to replicate any case beyond reports that spoke of absolute structural instability. In documents classified as unserviceable, there are also mentions of attempts to modify arthropods, particularly scorpions and centipedes, introduced into forced habitats with substances that were poured into the soil to alter their growth rate. And although the researchers sought to double their size, the only thing they achieved was that some molts came out incomplete, leaving bodies trapped within their own hardened skins, which caused an accumulation of dying specimens that had to be incinerated every week, with workers who had to use reinforced gloves for fear of unknown infections, although no transmissible disease was ever confirmed. In certain archives related to lacustrine studies, there appears the description of fish that were bred in tanks with high exposure to low-level radiation, trying to stimulate spontaneous changes in the gills and body length. This ended up generating specimens without eyes, with mouths turned to the sides, or with scales that detached with minimal contact. And although some different behaviors were recorded, such as constant circular swimming, none of that was considered useful, and the pools ended up empty, sealed with cement, after reports of leaks that could have contaminated nearby tributaries, although no remains were found downstream. A particular case occurred in the region of Bohemia, where an attempt was made to alter the structure of European hedgehogs through exclusive diets of animal proteins, seeking to modify the defensive pattern and increase the size of the quills. But what emerged was a line of specimens with severe spinal deformities, with curved spines that prevented them from fully curling up and exposed body areas without dermal coverage, which attracted infections and caused the majority to die before completing 1 month of life. Although some were sent to Berlin to be dissected and analyzed by teams that left no record of their observations, annotations were also discovered about experiments with river crustaceans, particularly in areas of the Danube, where the aim was to increase the aggressiveness of crabs through electrical stimuli applied during molting phases. This resulted in individuals showing erratic movements, loss of limbs, or defensive reactions against inanimate objects. And although the officials reported an increase in reaction speed during the first days, the behavior became chaotic, and there was no way to keep them alive for more than 2 weeks, forcing the studies to be stopped and the waste to be buried in wet earth without identification. In the internal reports written in encrypted language, other attempts with small mammals are mentioned, particularly badgers and martens, whose feeding and rest rhythm were modified to induce visible physical changes. But the results were thinner specimens, with fur loss and difficulties in reproducing, which was interpreted as a total failure. And even so, parallel lines continued that only provided premature corpses and empty cages until the technicians abandoned the tests and closed the notebooks with annotations crossed out by hand. On some occasions, worms and larvae were used as a basis to generate accelerated growth cycles through constant heat and ultraviolet light, which led to generations that aged in a matter of days, with segmented bodies that collapsed before reaching the adult phase. And although some showed changes in pigmentation, no mutation could be stabilized, so the experiment was eliminated and the jars destroyed along with the labels, to avoid uncomfortable questions during routine inspections. One of the few records that survived the emptying of the archives mentions experiments performed with imported tortoises, in which an attempt was made to remove the shell by mechanical means with the idea of observing regeneration under extreme conditions. This generated a series of internal deformities and fatal exposures that ended in a matter of hours. And although images of some that survived a couple of days were documented, the results were classified as repulsive, even by those who were accustomed to handling corpses in biological laboratories. In another section of the archives, there appear mentions of lizards that were injected with compounds derived from bovine glands with the intention of generating uncontrolled hormonal responses that would alter the metabolism. But what occurred was a progressive inflammation of the internal organs, loss of mobility, and generalized death within a few weeks. And although changes in skin color and an increase in the mass of certain areas were recorded, there was no continuity due to the accelerated deterioration of all specimens, which forced the cages to be discarded and disinfection with industrial chemicals to be applied. One of the last trials of this nature took place in East Prussia, where small rodents were used in an attempt to induce total loss of vision from birth, applying permanent bandages and alternative stimuli. But the result was an absolute dependence on smell and a constant stress reaction that prevented any form of socialization between specimens, with repetitive behaviors that culminated in cannibalism. This caused those responsible to abandon the experiment after considering that the effects were contrary to any goal of real adaptation. Near the end of these failed projects, there is mention of the breeding of subterranean amphibians, with the hope of generating organisms capable of resisting environments without light or ventilation. But the specimens obtained failed to complete development and died shortly after emerging, presenting malformations in the head and lack of motor coordination. This caused the tanks to be emptied and sealed, leaving only brief, unsigned annotations, while those responsible were reassigned to conventional agricultural tasks. Frontier creatures, the limits of Nazism between science and magic. Some circles within the Nazi apparatus, especially those more linked to esoteric currents and occultism, began to link certain species with invisible powers, attempting to create a direct connection between the biological and the magical. Unlike official breeding centers or laboratories supervised by veterinarians, these spaces functioned as closed chambers where archaic beliefs, ancient manuscripts, and a diffuse idea that the animal could be a doorway to the unknown were mixed. In those spaces, reptiles, nocturnal birds, and small carnivores were extracted from their usual environment and taken to scenarios where they were not analyzed for their biological qualities, but for the hidden meaning attributed to them. Snakes were placed inside stone circles adorned with writings taken from ancient texts, while certain owls were confined in lightless rooms, where people who presented themselves as mediums claimed that their gazes connected with invisible planes. These practices, never officially recognized, were recorded only in scattered fragments of personal notebooks, incomplete reports, and the testimonies of the very few who lived to tell the tale. In addition to these isolated actions, semi-clandestine gatherings were organized where military figures met with people who called themselves seers or interpreters of ancient symbols. In these spaces, animals were placed at the center of ceremonies where Nordic references, pagan elements, and a distorted use of cultural symbols that had nothing to do with science were combined. The curious thing is that these practices were not completely marginal. Some of them had the silent backing of second-tier figures in the regime who, although not participating directly, financed or tolerated the activity as part of a broader search for power through the irrational. For example, documents were discovered that mentioned the use of frogs in ceremonies linked to the prediction of war weather, where their movements were interpreted as signs of future victories or defeats. In other cases, insects collected in rural areas were used to elaborate potions that, according to the participants, could alter the perception of soldiers before entering combat. The reality behind these uses was much more rudimentary. There was no proven formula or rational structure. Everything was built around intuition, symbols, and an aesthetic of mystery that sought answers outside of any traditional logic. At the same time, some hidden enclosures in forested areas of southern Germany and Austria harbored animals that were not studied for their behavior, but for their supposed ability to emit frequencies associated with altered states. These were experiments without methodology, where participants noted subjective reactions after listening to the sounds emitted by crickets or crows, confined in spaces specially designed to amplify their echo. These practices not only strayed from science, but showed an obsessive fascination with the frontier between the visible and the occult. In parallel, there were attempts to link certain species with mystical genealogical lines, as if determined animals carried a direct connection with lost cultures that, according to the organizers of these ceremonies, had possessed superior knowledge. These practices were also linked to objects. Not only animals were part of the rite, but also bones, skins, or fragments of bodies that were considered relics carrying an ancestral energy. Reports have been found describing how remains of dissected animals were kept in chests closed with iron padlocks, and how, on certain nights, they were opened only to be contemplated during private rituals, in which less than a dozen people participated. The attendees were neither scientists nor scholars, but members of a parallel structure where the symbolic weighed more than any provable data. Even within the SS, there were currents interested in this type of practice, although they were not official or recognized as part of the apparatus. Some sectors explored the use of animals as instruments of spiritual orientation in an attempt to connect territorial domination with magical legitimacy. There was talk in low voices of invisible guardians, and excursions to the forest were organized with guides external to the military sphere, men dedicated to reading tracks and observing animal behaviors as if they were coded messages of destiny. There were no orders or instructions, only free and arbitrary interpretations that were, however, taken seriously by those who participated. As the war advanced and defeats accumulated, these practices did not disappear but intensified in some sectors. It was eventually thought that the rational was no longer enough, and that only an invisible energy could reverse the course of events. That was when the presence of rituals with wild birds increased, especially those that sang at night, and new elements were introduced, such as geometric drawings painted on the ground with animal blood. Ancient maps, dates linked to solstices, and fragments of stone brought from sites considered energetically charged were used. None of that altered the course of events. The defensive lines collapsed, and the cities fell without restraint. Even so, those participating in these practices persisted in their conviction. They affirmed that time did not move in a straight line, and that the effects of their ceremonies would only manifest on another plane. That notion of invisible continuity, combined with a deliberate rejection of all provable logic, turned these groups into isolated nuclei, where it was claimed that the tangible was nothing more than a transitory appearance. In those spaces, animals were not understood as physical beings, but as entities laden with hidden meaning, used to summon forces that no one dared to define. Even more closed groups also emerged that used skins, fangs, or skulls to construct ritual objects that did not respond to any visible Nazi iconography. There, no swastikas or known emblems appeared, but strange symbols, often copied from cultures that had no direct relation to the European continent. References were detected to Siberian shamanism, African tribes, and pre-Columbian codices, always interpreted freely and distortedly. The animal, once again, was the chosen vehicle to give form to those beliefs. Behind that symbolic use lay a barely documented history, the Third Reich's project to resurrect the ancient forests of the Germanic imaginary through the return of species that had disappeared centuries ago. As part of that irrational vision of establishing an eternal empire, concrete plans were outlined to populate eastern territories with Aryan colonies and large reserves where only creatures adapted to the racial ideal would live. Both Goering and Himmler called upon leading specialists in the country to promote a genetic modification campaign aimed at redirecting the natural environment, both in wildlife and domestic animals. In that combination of political power and scientific ambition, this history reveals how the Nazis sought to subjugate nature to their own schemes and alter the very course of evolution.